Have you been in an abusive relationship? Could you have symptoms of CPTSD? Sometimes we can be unaware we have endured abuse, and so we don't even know that we need healing. But without some healing at some point, we will have difficulty moving forward in life. Listen to today's episode as we interview Tabitha Westbrook, a licensed therapist, as she explains what abuse is, how to identify if you've been abused, and what steps to take for healing.
Welcome to the Jesus People Sisterhood podcast, a place where Christian single women age 50 plus connect. I am your host, Janine Jordan, a Christian confidence coach and leadership mentor in Alberta, Canada.
And I'm your co-host, Ellie McCormick, a Christian longevity coach and mentor in the USA. Being single women over 50, we know what it's like to feel overlooked, to have unrealized dreams, to experience the challenges of singlehood, and to be concerned about what our future will look like. We couldn't find anything online for single Christian women over 50, so we created Jesus People Sisterhood just for you, a place where sisters encourage and empower one another through the last third of life, because you are a treasure trove of wisdom and of exceedingly great value. This is an authentic community, a supportive family, with other women on the same journey where Jesus is the center of it all. Here you will find real talk, real community, and real sisters.
Join us as we discuss building relationships, whole health, and growing spiritually. We'll review helpful books and articles, chat with guest speakers, share success stories, and have some laughs along the way. So grab your favorite beverage and we'll get started.
Today, we send a big shout out to our sisters in Washington, D.C. and Portugal. Thank you for listening. We're so glad that sisters from around the world are listening to the podcast. And here's a review from Encourage with God's Love, who writes, encouraging. It's great to hear that there is encouraging for single women over 50. There are so many challenges at this age with a husband, much more without a husband. The key is to unite with a group of Christians who pray for one another. They held hands around the coffee table to pray every time. They placed hands on the sick to be healed physically and delivered. Thank you, Encourage with God's Love, for your positive review, and we are so pleased you enjoy the podcast. If you would like your review read on one of the episodes, please leave us a 5-star written review on Apple Podcasts. It only takes you a minute, and it raises the podcast in the rankings so that other sisters can find us too.
Welcome, sisters, to this episode of the Jesus People Sisterhood podcast, the only podcast specifically for single Christian women over 50. In today's episode, we'll be discussing abuse and CPTSD with Tabitha Westbrook. Tabitha is a licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed professional counselor, and licensed clinical mental health counselor. She's the founder and CEO of a counseling clinic with offices in Texas and North Carolina. Most importantly, she's an expert in and a national speaker on abuse and how it harms women and how they can heal. Hi, Tabby. Welcome to the Jesus People Sisterhood podcast.
I'm really excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you as well. Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a licensed professional counselor supervisor, licensed marriage and family therapist supervisor, and licensed clinical mental health counselor qualified supervisor, along with a bunch of other certifications in therapy things. We will just call me alphabet soup and make it easy. Folks can go look at my bio if they want to know more. But basically, I'm a licensed counselor. I specialize in complex trauma and domestic abuse and coercive control, particularly in the Christian church. And I have a practice with offices in Central North Carolina and North Texas. And so we see clients who are experiencing the worst of the worst of the worst things you can imagine. That is what we specialize in. And we also help educate churches on the dynamics of abuse. As part of that, I am part of the teaching team for a faith-based advocacy program through a nonprofit ministry called Called to Peace. And I also help lead better intervention and prevention group, also through Called to Peace for destructive men and abusive men.
Okay, great. Are you mostly in North Texas or the Carolinas, or
I
you?
get around.
Okay.
I technically live in Texas, but between speaking and going between my two offices, I'm on the road quite a bit. So people like to joke because I do drive a camper van. Her name is Vanquility. And so not even my own team sometimes knows where I am. They're like, where in the world are you today? So yes, technically I'm in Texas, but I'm a lot of other places as well.
Okay. I love Vanquility. Okay. Well, let's jump in because this is a very important conversation. Please tell us, what is abuse and what is CPTSD?
So we're going to start with what CPTSD is. So PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. And so it got its name from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Version 5 is the one that we're on. And it's a list of things that we experience when we've been traumatized. And it's a whole range of things, from flashbacks, which means we kind of feel or see things that happened to us in the past that were bad, to having all these thoughts about it, which we would call rumination, which is that thinking, to all kinds of body sensations and feelings. And so there's a whole list of criteria that would make that diagnosable. CPTSD is adding complex to the post-traumatic stress disorder. And so folks will say, well, what does that mean? Typically what it means is it is trauma that's gone on a really long time. And so it can start in childhood, or it can start in like a marriage relationship, or dating relationship where we're being abused or being harmed. And so it stacks on itself. One of the things I like to say is that trauma is cumulative, which means like the more you have of it, the worse it affects you. The earlier it starts and the more powerful the person is traumatizing you, the worse it's going to be. And so just to give a quick little definition of trauma, like we all have bad stuff happen, right? We're not all traumatized when bad stuff happens. If I get in a really bad car wreck and I'm really scared, that was a traumatic experience. That's like, oh my gosh, that's really awful. It's super terrible. If I'm able to walk away and I don't need the jaws of life to get me out, I'm not super injured, I can call a friend and cry and talk with her about it and get that support, and oh my gosh, and you get that empathy. It's so bad. It is. That was terrible. I'm so glad you're alive. All of those things. I'm going to feel it. And I might have a couple of shaky moments getting in a car. I might have a couple thoughts about where I drive, but I'm not traumatized. I can still get in the car. I can still drive. It was terrible, was not fun, but it's not going to leave the lasting mark that complex trauma or any other big relational traumas in particular will leave for me. Gabor Mate, who is an author, psychiatrist, who talks a lot about trauma, it says, trauma isn't what happened to you, it's what happened in you because of what happened to you. And that's accurate. And it is in the absence of an empathic witness. So when we are in that space where we're being abused or harmed or having terrible things happen to us over and over again, and we don't have that empathic witness, we don't have autonomy, we cannot walk away from it, we don't have that sense of power and agency, that is going to tell us things about ourselves. And then that causes all kinds of problems, right? Because our bodies know. There's a ton of neuroscience research that says that trauma gets written into ourselves. And so our bodies feel it, right? So it's that like awful sensation when you walk into a place where bad things happen and you're like, oh, I don't like this. This feels icky. Or you're around a person who is harmful to you. Oh, no, not good, right? So complex trauma can happen in a variety of ways, but really truthfully, we see it in those relational spaces. And that's going to bring us to abuse. So abuse, it can mean a lot of different things. A lot of people often think of it as domestic violence. And that is not my favorite way to say it. And I would say anybody that does a lot of work in this space does not want to say it that way either, because it isn't always physical or sexual violence. You can abuse someone without laying a hand on them. So the terms I tend to favor are coercive control. And that is much more insidious. So one of the things that we hear a lot these days, and I'm going to step on my soapbox for just a moment, and I hope that's okay, is narcissistic abuse or covert narcissism or all of those things. we don't love those. And I'll tell you why. First of all, it's giving it a mental health label that is probably not accurate. And I know that's going to feel super weird to people, but not all narcissists are abusers, and not all abusers are narcissists. And that's trippy, right? Because you're like, wait, isn't a narcissist all about themselves? And yes, but that doesn't mean they control you. And I think that's where coercive control is so much more wise and better language, right? And also, if you go into court and you are trying to work on child custody issues and divorce issues and things like that, and you say, well, he is a narcissist, then the judge is going to go, and you're a high conflict labeler and you don't look good. And we have seen people lose their kids and lose access to their children because of things like that, because they're trying to be heard. And I totally get that. But like the courts don't understand what you're trying to say. And so we want to use really good language. Ultimately, the core of abuse is power and control. And so when we look at what coercive control is, it is the attempt to treat you as property and have power and control over every aspect of your life, or as many as they possibly can. It looks different in different situations at times, but it really is at its very core tearing down the image of God in another person, if we just want to distill it down to something super simple. And so the way that looks is through using different tactics. And there's a bunch of them, none of which require you to touch anyone, actually. One of my favorite illustrative models of this is Duluth's power and control wheel. And what that is an image that has kind of a bunch of different aspects of abuse in it, with the hub of that wheel being power and control, and the outside rim being physical and sexual violence. Inside are all the things that can happen without laying a hand on somebody else. So economic control, you don't know what your finances look like. You don't have access. You're not allowed to spend money at the grocery store. I had plenty of clients who have been told, this is your grocery budget. And it's like ridiculously low. And they don't know how, if they go over, it's terrible. They don't have any view to what's in the bank account, but yet the abuser can spend whatever they want. Intimidation. And this doesn't have to be physical. Had plenty of my clients where their abuser stood in the doorway of the bedroom at 3 a.m. and wouldn't let them leave, or would go out. And I'm going to be pretty direct. So I'm going to kind of pull back for just a second, give a little bit of a trigger warning before I say what I'm about to say. I don't know where the folks who are going to be listening to this are in their own walk and healing. And so I just want to invite people that if anything that I say is really hard, really triggering, and you're like, oh my goodness gracious, push pause on the podcast, go take care of you, and you can come back to it. You are the only you that you have. You are not broken, because some of these things are still really hard to talk about. Maybe you've never even talked about them before. And so I just want to be really mindful that if you're like, I can't believe she said that out loud, and oh my, that really is close to my story, that's okay. And so I want you to just take that breath, take care of you, and you can always come back to this. It will be here. It's beauty podcasts. They're always around, right? Mm-hmm. And so like in terms of intimidation, I've had clients whose spouses have gone out and shot the dogs and said, the next time that will be you, right? And though, like, what message does that send, right? Or where they grab them and say, you need to do this. If you don't, it will be bad, right? Or, well, you wouldn't want me to do anything to hurt myself, would you? So I'm not going out alone, right? Like, these are things that clients hear, and like, that's pretty scary. And the thing is, like, there's that fine line between words and actions, and the victim knows that they mean it. Like, it's not like, this isn't a joke, it's not a game. I know this could happen, right? There's using the kids. Well, if you leave me, then I will tell the police that you're a drug addict. By the time they figure out that you're not, I'll be gone with the children. If you leave me, I will definitely make sure you never see your children again. And if you leave me, I'll report you to CPS, which is Child Protective Services, or any social services agency that would monitor the safety and welfare of children. They'll tell children the terrible things about the other parent. Well, your mom is wicked and evil. And you know what? Your mom is just trying to get me thrown in jail. Right? What's a little kiddo supposed to do with that? It's so unfair. Using male privilege. And this is gendered conversation, because truly the majority of abuse that we see, and it's not all abuse, but the majority is male to female abuse.
Yeah.
And especially because this is a podcast for our beautiful sisters, I will continue that gendered language. I will acknowledge here because I know someone out there is going, can't it go in the other direction? Yes, of course it can. And if you had an abusive mom, yes, absolutely. We know it can go in that direction as well, 100%. In this case, I'm really talking to our beautiful listeners who are over 50 and going, what happened to me? And oh my gosh, this sounds awfully familiar, right? So we have all these different categories. Minimizing, denying, and blaming is probably the one I see the most. This is where we put gaslighting in, right? The sky is not actually blue, right? No, it's really purple. And like, they're so convincing. You're like, well, maybe the sky is purple. And like, I mean, I guess it could be the sun. Like, and then you're like, why am I like thinking this at all? And like, and like, you're like, wow, that's a lot. It's like, well, that didn't really happen. You didn't really catch me looking at pornography. Like, it really wasn't that. You must be mistaken. Someone else used our credit card to purchase a prostitute, right? Like, all of these things. That's not really my hotel charge. I guess I better call and get that taken off because that didn't really happen, right? And they're so convincing that you start to go, wait, what? And in the whole time, they are pushing down your worth and value. They're telling you all of these things about who you are and what your identity is that are not true. You're worthless. You're stupid, right? And they don't have to say it in words. They say it in implicit things. Now, sometimes it's super overt. A lot of times it's not. It's, you know what, man, it'd be a lot easier for me if you would just keep house a little bit better. You know, I wish you could cook like my mom. Things like that are saying like, you're not good enough. I better keep the finances. I just know that girls aren't good with numbers. I'm the head of the household. This is one of the ones that we hear in the Christian community often. I'm the head of the household. I make all the decisions. Ephesians says you should submit to me, and I have strong feelings on some of the ways that these things are distorted, because that is not actually what the Lord is talking about at all. And so like we hear all these things, and so it really is a systematic chipping away of who you are and taking control over your life all the way until you're like, something is wrong in my marriage and I don't know what it is, or my relationship. You don't have to be married to be in an abusive relationship. And then you get out and you're like, I don't know what happened. Like, something bad has happened and I'm a mess and I don't know what to do. And so like, it's a super long explanation for both CPTSD and abuse, but I really just that insidious nature of that control of taking over your life. Dr. Deborah Wingfield, who wrote the book Eyes Wide Open, and is she has been educating advocates for forever. She's brilliant. She talks about it in terms of a captivity crime. So you look at it as a funnel where the top part is like things are wide, you can still kind of do some things for yourself. And then over time, as they get you, it narrows until you can't basically take a breath without the other person saying it's okay.
Mm.
So it really is like being a prisoner of war.
Wow. Wow. Thanks so much for that explanation, because I think it needed to be detailed. Because abuse is, you can't define it in one sentence.
You can't. It's very sneaky, right? Like, again, like if it was super obvious, we'd be like, don't do that. That's dumb. Right? Like, and I think like we all know that, I won't say we all know, but I would say most people know that like if somebody's beating you, then that's probably a bad idea and it's wrong, right? And we would almost all of us would call that abuse. But when it's, I'm going to leave every single cabinet door open just to start hurting you, right? It's like, well, is it illegal or wicked to leave cabinet doors open, right? And they're like, well, I'm just ADHD. I can't remember to close it. And it's like, every single cabinet door, exactly the same amount open, I have questions, right? And then you have to go close them all, right? And you're systematically going, your perception of the world is inaccurate, right? And then when we add in the spiritual abuse component of it, which is by far what I think is the most wicked of it, like none of it's great, but this is really, really not great. You take someone's good and right devotion to God and weaponize it against them. So if you take one of our beautiful sisters who truly loves the Lord and wants to follow and serve him and say to her, you have to submit to me. Your body is not your body. I get to do whatever I want with it whenever I want. And she loves the Lord and she wants to be a good wife. She's going to be like, okay. And in those contexts, things get super twisted. And then you add in like Malachi, God hates divorce, which is completely pulled out of context all of the time. And then it's like, well, now I'm trapped here, and then you have pastors who come alongside because they don't know better. yet, though we're trying to tell them all, and say, well, you're suffering for Christ, or it's not that bad, or he didn't hit you, or maybe you should have more sex, or other ridiculous things. And so then we have our poor sister who's like in captivity. Her body is registering it. Her mind doesn't know what to do with it. And she's like, I'm anxious and depressed, and I don't know what's going on. I tell you, like most of the women that come in, because there's more awareness now, I am hearing the word abuse more, which I truly appreciate. But most don't come in and go, I think I'm in a coercively controlling or abusive relationship. They come in and they say, I am anxious and I need to be a better spouse. Or I am divorced now because my spouse left me for another woman and I need to figure out what I did wrong that made him not love me.
Yeah.
And I sit across from them and I hear their story and I'm like, that actually is not it. And so then we have to kind of get into all those details about like, tell me your story and let's talk about what that really looked like for you and what it really was. But you end up believing all the lies spoken over you, that you aren't enough and you are the problem. And if you only, then I would only. If you really loved me better, then I wouldn't have to treat you this way. And our sisters end up single going, I don't know which way is up. I don't even know who I am.
Right. I have listened to people talk about things that I thought were horrific. I've experienced things that I downplayed and just dismissed because I thought it was my fault. And it's amazing how we talk to ourselves and take the blame for it. It's just so good to hear you say the things that you're saying. And thank you for that. Yeah, that was wonderful. Yeah.
I think that's one of the biggest tactics, honestly, of abusers is making them think it's your voice, right? Like the way I language it is it comes from Dan Allender's work, A Vows and Curses, right? So these curses are things that are spoken over us about our identity. So you are this, right? And it's usually nothing like what God says at all. Like you are worthless, you are stupid, you can't do anything. It's either implicit or explicit, but the message is there. And then the vow is when we go, that must be true. And we drink it in. And then we say it to ourselves, I am stupid. I can't do this. I don't know how to do finances. I am incompetent. I am a terrible partner. I am this, right? And even when the abuse is done, like let's say you get out and you're like, okay, I do realize that was coercive control. It was abusive. It was bad, right? And then you hear yourself go, so stupid. How could I be this dumb? Right? And in that moment, we've become the abuser to our own self because we've drunk in that, made the vow with ultimately, because I do believe that abuse is fueled by the kingdom of darkness. We're making a vow with the enemy. And we're saying, I am going to agree that these things that my abuser said were true. And now I'm going to say them to me. And so now the abuser doesn't even have to say them. We're saying them. And it's like, oh, goodness, but they feel true. I think that's the other thing, right? They feel so true. And that can be a really sticky place for a lot of people. But if you only knew, if you knew everything, you wouldn't love me. You couldn't love me if you knew all these things. And I'm like, dude, if we all walked outside with a PowerPoint above our heads of all the things that go through our heads and our experiences, we'd all be in the house because we're all the same, right? We all have broken parts. We all have struggles. We're all lovable. And what God says about us is totally different than what our abusers say.
Yes, 100%. So you've already shared a lot of things that probably our listeners might be recognizing maybe in their own life. But could you speak more to how someone would know if they've been abused?
Absolutely. Could you ever disagree in your relationship? Ever, right? And that is even true. Like if it's developmental trauma where it's like abuse from a parent, can you disagree? Right? Even with kids right now, yes, your child does need to put their shoes on before they go out in the snow, maybe. In Canada, probably, or upper Minnesota, or not Texas, right? Like in Texas, you're like, snow, what's that? So yes, there are things that as parents, we need to kind of be like, hey, this is kind of a deal breaker, right? Got to do that. But can you have your own thoughts and feelings? Can you ask questions about things, right? When you're a kid, could you do those things? And again, it's not just the 436 whys that we get when our kiddos are little. And we're like, if you ask me why one more time, I don't know what's going to happen because boy, that's a lot of whys, right? But a reasonable question, I don't understand this, or could this be different, or I want to do this with a friend. Like something reasonable, not illegal activities, please. But like, I want to go with a friend to the mall. Do people go to malls anymore? I don't know. But if they did, that should be like, well, if we can't, then here's why. But like, yes, or, whatever. It shouldn't be, how dare you ask me if you can go to the mall, right? It shouldn't be met with punishment, like wicked punishment, if we don't comply to certain things, right? Obviously, sexual and physical abuse are a little more clear sometimes. I will say sexual abuse is not always super clear. There are things that happen that are very covert in that arena, and folks don't quite understand. Like if a father sexualizes the daughter's body, and is making comments about her breasts and body and bottom and all these things, that is a form of sexual abuse that is totally inappropriate. Not like, hey, you should probably wear enough clothes when you go outside that like everybody can't see everything, but like, oh, your breasts are really developing, and I'm noticing how voluptuous are becoming, which is stuff I hear from my clients that their dads say to them. And it's like not as obvious, right? But these are the things that we're like, okay, like this is how I'm identifying. And in a relationship, if I disagreed, right? So let's say I want tacos for dinner, and I'm like, hey, could we go to Taco Bell? Now, some of you out there might be thinking there are better purveyors of tacos, but most people know what Taco Bell is. So I'm just using it as an example. Please eat tacos of your own choosing. But you say, I want to go to Taco Bell. And your significant other says, God, Taco Bell, that is literally trash tacos. Like those aren't even good. I can't even look, I don't even know why I'm with you. Those are the kind of tacos that you want? Oh, okay. I mean, like, I guess we could get you Taco Bell, but you know what? I really want fried chicken, so we're gonna go to Kentucky Fried Chicken. If I don't think they use the whole name anymore, we're gonna go to KFC. Whatever. We're gonna go do that. Like, your taste is terrible, right? That's a little bit of a frivolous example, though I have heard similar things from clients in that vein of like restaurant choosing, where it's like, oh, all right. I mean, I guess I must be dumb. I mean, 99-cent taco sounds great, but I don't know if you guys have ever had a Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. I do think they're tasty. But, and it's like, you're not free to have your own self, your own opinion, your own preferences, right? There's nothing sinful about wanting a particular kind of taco or food or anything like that, right? It is not wicked. And, unless the Lord himself has said, you're not allowed to eat at Taco Bell, there's really no sin in that. And so to be treated in such an ugly way about a preference that you have. So if you have a preference for a certain kind of sweater or, a candle in the house. I remember a client whose spouse would not let them have mums, like the potted plant things that you get with the pretty flowers on them in fall, like in Southeastern United States. They were not allowed because he didn't like them. Couldn't have them, not allowed. Down to like the type of bushes that they planted at their house was the control. And so like those are things that were like, well, I mean, I guess if he really doesn't like the moms, then I won't have them. But like it was not just like, hey, I'm allergic to them. It would really be great if they weren't on our porch, right? That'd be reasonable. It's you're not allowed because I don't like them because they're not my preference, right? And that's where we start to see that control, right? What happens if you spend an extra $5 if you were allowed to even do that at the grocery store? What is the response when you come home if you have disappointed, or I hate this word because it's not an obedience thing, but disobeyed? You can't see the air quotes if you're listening to this, but I'm air quoting the word disobeyed, or did something he didn't agree with. Then you caught hell. You might get silent treatment for like days or sometimes even weeks. You might be forced to have sex when you don't want to have sex. You'd say, I legitimately actually have a headache. Like that is a reasonable, first of all, no is a complete sentence without anything else with it. If you don't want to have sex, you can say no, and that should be enough without any justification. But we will say that you are like, well, I like sex, and I'm going to say I have a headache because I do, in fact, have a headache. And he says, well, it is your wifely duty to do this to me, do this for me, and you have no ability to say no to that. Your yes was at the altar, which is not scripturally true, by the way. And in the United States, all 50 states do have laws against marital rape because no is no, even if you are married. I can't speak to Canada. I don't know their laws as well. And as well, I mean, at all. But in the United States, it is marital rape if you say no and you're forced to have sex anyway. And so like those are places where you can start to go, hey, something's out of balance here. And those would all be abusive things. And some are immoral, but not illegal, right? Like not letting you eat at a certain restaurant is not an illegal type of coercive control or abuse, but it's really immoral, right? Is that treating your spouse with love the way that the Christ loves you? Is that loving your wife as you love your own body, which is what the Bible says, right? Is it loving her like Christ loved the church, which is what it says to it, which by the way was to death. Jesus sacrificed himself. Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Like we have these examples of what it looks like to love like that. And if those aren't what you're doing, then it's out of balance, right? If that's what your spouse is doing to you, then if they're not doing those things, he's out of balance. And so those are ways to start knowing, do I have any autonomy? Do I have any agency? Can I have a preference? Am I allowed to have any thoughts of my actual own? Right? Like those are all great indicators that something is amiss, and it is very likely coercive control or abuse.
I'd like to add my own experience because it is a little bit different, just for our listeners in case they experience kind of what I did, in that I was in a very conservative stream of Christianity, and so I did try to make my husband kind of the leader and all that, but he really didn't use and abuse that in the sense of telling me I have to obey him or anything. But basically, I think the best way to describe my marriage was we were kind of like me and my children were kind of like a fake storefront for this person's hidden life. And so we were like the facade that everybody saw at church or at his job. I think sometimes at his job, people saw a little bit more of him because they weren't Christians, so he could show who he really was a little bit more there. It wasn't so much that he would order me around and purposely try and do things to hurt me as much as he just really didn't care about me at all. He had an addiction. Addicts, whatever addiction they have, they blame everybody else for it, especially their spouse. He had a whole secret sin life, and so we were just the cover up for that. And obviously, if you're in a marriage or a family like that, that's abuse. You're being used and you're being abused, even though the person may not purposely order you around or go out of their way to do mean things to you. They are mean to you just offhandedly because they blame you for their unhappy life, or if you are not living up to the facade that they're trying to put there, because they don't want to give you any attention. They don't want to do anything for you. You are just the facade. So I wanted to bring that up because I know there's might be other women like me who were in that marriage where they were just the facade for that person's sin life, and the person didn't necessarily order them around or do those kind of things on a regular basis, but they're still being abused. I mean, it's the destruction of you. It's like you have no value, you're nothing. You're just being. So anyway, I just wanted to share that in case somebody is listening and saying, well, he didn't do that and he didn't. Well, he doesn't have to have been that you were abused.
Right. And I will say about addiction, because it's a complex thing. So one of my many letters that are involved in my name is certified sex addiction therapist. So I work with, folks who struggle with addiction and compulsion in the sexual arena, both men and women. And not all addicts are abusers, but all addiction is abusive, right? And
Yeah.
where we see the difference is that value piece, right? So the guys who are struggling, they are heartbroken over what it's doing to their families. Now, they might be in denial for a little while. They might, they've done shady things. So please don't hear me discount the trauma of the betrayal, because it is still awful, right? It's not good. The marriage may not last through it. Like it is super harmful, but they are not indifferent to their spouse. They're heartbroken over it. And again, the relationship may not be able to survive that, because that's a deep betrayal. And, especially if it's gone a long time and you find out about the secret life and you're like, holy Toledo, and they're not even slightly repentant. That's when we get into, what do you believe about your spouse to begin with, right? And it is that indifference. It is, you don't matter. You are a piece of property to make me look good so I can go over here and gratify myself. It is consumptive, it is wicked, and it is abusive. And that would be abuse, 100%. of like, my wife and kids are over here doing this thing and like living their lives and thinking we are one thing. And there's this undercurrent. And I don't really care about them because they're like a couch. It's like I have a really nice furnished home. And there's food there when I get back from my escapades. And it's so awful and so wicked, right? And it really is. That is absolutely abusive. So they don't have to be necessarily mean to you, but they are exploiting you and they are using you and they are using typically your faith to keep you there.
Yeah.
Right. And to keep you from looking into things. And that's where like the financial control, like I'm not going to let you see the finances because then you're going to see all these things I'm buying online that I'd rather you didn't. And I'm going to be like nice enough to you, but you don't really have freedom. Right. And then there's this whole other thing, where they're totally somebody else.
Right. Exactly.
And that's a terrible place. Right. And it's that hidden thing because then you're like, am I crazy? What's happening here? Something. And our bodies know. Right. Our bodies know. And we're like, something doesn't feel right. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what it is. I worked with a woman who her husband was quite abusive in many facets of it. Right. But like there was something, she's like, there's something I don't know. There's something off. I don't know what's happening. And she was cleaning. And she was like, we haven't cleaned out this DVD cabinet when we all used DVDs and didn't do everything online. And she's cleaning out the DVD cabinet and wiping it out. And she's like putting them back. And she's like, I'll alphabetize them. Oh, no. She found some titles that she did not expect to find. And she was like, oh, what happened? And when she confronted him, because, how could you not, right? And he was like, look, you're not giving me enough. I got to go get it somewhere else. Which is a lie, by the way. No man will die if he does not have sex every 72 hours. For some reason, somewhere in premarital counseling, this started coming up like back in the 80s and 90s. I can't find the genesis of it. I guess if I looked hard enough, I could. I just don't care because it's wrong. They were like, oh, men have to have sex every 72 hours or they'll stray. That is not a true statement, first of all. Secondly, how did they all get to be adults if that was true? And then it's like, oh, there'll be physiological problems. This is what I tell the groups of abusers that I work with. I've never seen anyone explode after not having sex for 72 hours. If they're going to, I would like them to videotape it so that I can research it, understand the physiological process that took place, and make a lot of money. But since I am not sitting on a beach with a fruity drink and an umbrella in it, that has never happened. And I've been doing this a long time. So it's not a true statement.
For the sake of time, we're stopping the interview here. We'll pick it back up with Tabby Westbrook next week and conclude our interview in part 2 of identifying and healing from abuse and CPTSD. Please share any thoughts that resonated with you from today's podcast episode in our private Facebook group at Jesus People Sisterhood Community. Start reaching out to other single women and create your local group of Jesus People Sisters. Please let us know about your group to add to our directory by contacting us at support@JesusPeopleSisterhood.com.
Have you had a good experience with a business? They treated you honestly and helped you at a reasonable price? Please let us know. We would like to start a directory of JPS-friendly businesses. Let's care for one another.
That's all we have for today, sisters. Be blessed by him who is able to protect you from stumbling and to make you stand in the presence of his glory, blameless and with great joy. Until next time.
Hey, sister, before you go, thank you for listening. If you found value in today's podcast, the best way to say thank you is by leaving a 5-star written review at Apple Podcasts. That raises us in the rankings and helps other sisters find us too. And please tell a friend or post it on your social media. If you're a single Christian woman over 50, this podcast was created specifically for you. The Jesus People Sisterhood is your community to find support and friendship with other sisters who can understand. Be sure to follow us on your podcast app and join our free private Facebook group at Jesus People Sisterhood Community.
Jesus People Sisterhood has also started a private Facebook group for housing and co-living opportunities. You can check that out at Jesus People Sisterhood Senior Housing. You can also find us on Facebook at Jesus People Sisterhood and individually for Janine at riseupcoachingandconsulting.com and for Ellie at samaramountain.com. And ladies, this is the necessary disclaimer. Our podcast content is for informational purposes and does not constitute professional advice from mental health, medical, legal, financial, or other areas. The opinions of the guest do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the hosts. It is our heart that this podcast will be a blessing to you. Together, let's build a powerful sisterhood with Jesus. Make a friend, add a sister, across the border and around the world.